consider moving up. It's not like shul where you
It is like shul. It is shul.
You're welcome to move closer.
It's not like shul. It is shul.
Right. I started.
Good for you. God bless you.
And if they miss my introduction. Good evening and welcome. I invite everybody to please find your seats as we're going to get started in just a moment. As the people who come often know, I like to start things on time to respect those of you who knew you were coming at 7:30. Thanks, George. Thank you. Appreciate it. Good evening. I have been looking forward to this series for several months since we put it together. This is the Crash Course in Jewish History, 2,000 years of Jewish history in about 4 hours. An hour tonight with Rabbi Dr. Burton Visotzky, who I'll speak about in a minute, an hour on medieval Jewish history with Benjamin Gampel in January, an hour of modern Jewish history with David Fishman in February, and an hour on American Jewish history with Shuli Reuben Schwartz in March. And then as a bonus, there is an introduction to Israeli history through Israeli comedy with Israeli stand-up comedian Benji Lovett in April. So over the next several months together, all of us will have an opportunity to learn. I'm really excited. As you can see around, there are a number of teens here tonight. I've reached out to all of our teens, not all of them, many of them, most of them could not make it tonight because it was just a few days ago. But for any teen that comes to 3 out of the 4 sessions, we'll be getting a rabbinic certificate in Jewish history. And I will be taking them to a bookstore to think about a Jewish book that they should choose that I hope will encourage them to think about Jewish studies eventually when they get to the college campus. So I want to give a shout out to our students who are here. It's not easy. Yes, it's not easy to come on any night. So by way of introduction, this past Sunday was a bittersweet day. I was at Congregation Anshe Chesed on the Upper West Side for the funeral of one of my teachers, Rabbi Neil Gilman. Rabbi Gilman was a teacher of mine as an undergraduate and in rabbinical school. He passed away last Friday, and he was one of the preeminent theologians in the conservative movement and beyond in the 20th and 21st century, and I learned so much from him. But I didn't just learn so much from him alone. I learned from him in the context of being a student at JTS, where we learned to explore ideas, where we learned to explore content, and how ideas and content could bring meaning to all of our lives. So I knew that once I heard he passed away, I want to dedicate these 4 lectures in his memory because he was such a profound teacher and scholar to so many of us, and I think in generations to come. That brings me to tonight to invite Rabbi Dr., or just Bert, as he is called by his students, Burton Visotzky. Bert's passion is Midrash and rabbinic literature, and tonight he'll be giving us a history of ancient Judaism through the concept of rabbinic literature and rabbinic history. Bert was my college advisor. I received a master's in Midrash, along with I didn't receive a master's in Midrash. I received a bachelor's of arts in Midrash and a bachelor's of arts in American history at Barnard.
Yeah, Dave was the one who had
my husband, received a master's in Midrash, and Bert was Dave's advisor during rabbinical school. So we spent a lot of time together. But more importantly than any of the studying we did together, many of you next year, a year from now, when Jared becomes bar mitzvah on this bima, you're going to say, I remember when he was just 6 years old running around this bima. Bert Visotzky was in my living room when my water broke. He was in Syracuse to be our scholar in residence. It was November. I went to the kitchen to take the chicken out of the refrigerator to get Shabbat dinner ready before he was going to speak at the congregation, and I went into labor. And I said to Dave, Dave, I think we have a problem. Dave froze, and Bert said, Dave, you have two options. You take Rachel to the hospital, or you give the lecture that I'm supposed to give. What are you going to do? So Bert came to the hospital Saturday night after Shabbat, and he was the first one after our parents to see Jared as a baby. So I feel a very special connection to Bert, a very special connection to JTS, and I'm really pleased to bring my learning as a student to everybody here tonight. So thank you for being here, and Bert, thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. Rachel left out part of the story, which was when Dave and Rachel left for the hospital, which is what they should have done. Rachel turns around and says, oh, by the way, we're having 8 people for dinner. So I cooked dinner that night, too. But it was not the first time I had gone to a rabbi's home and she went into labor. So I was ready, and when I came tonight, I just checked in with Rachel to make sure everything was okay. I also want to acknowledge the death of my teacher, Neil Gilman. My very first visit to the Jewish Theological Seminary, when I was in college, we had to come for pre-interviews, and I met Neil. It probably took me decades to be able to call him Neil and not Rabbi Gilman. But he did things the right way. I was a kid from Chicago, and when I came to New York and came to rabbinical school, Neil invited me to his home for a Shabbat dinner. He had 2 young daughters, a good deal younger than me, but they were just lovely, sweet kids. And one of the things I learned very quickly was at their Shabbat table, they liked to sing, and they sing beautifully. And I began to learn some of the Gilman tunes. And then that first year, and then the second year, and then the third year, they invited me to their Passover Seder. Now, I'd grown up in a nice conservative Jewish home. We had a serious Seder. My grandfather, may he rest in peace, led the Seder. My father and his sister, Aunt Ida, were really Hebrew fluent and would race through the latter part of the Seder. That wasn't the way of the Gilman's home. In the Gilman's home, they sing everything, and they sing with their beautiful voices. And I learned really all the Seder tunes. I still sing some of the Gilman tunes at my family Seder. And we finally finished the Seder. It was 3, 4 in the morning, and I came out of his big apartment on West End Avenue, and there were all these Jews on the street coming home from their Seder. Coming from Chicago, I had never seen this. And I don't know if it happens over here on the east side, but on my side of town, there are a lot of Jews, and a lot of different flavor of Jews. And one of the really lovely things about the neighborhood and about Rabbi Gilman is that we all greet one another respectfully and wish each other a good Yontif. And it is still the case on Passover. We don't go till 3 in the morning, but when my guests leave, they see all the Jews walking up and down, strolling, spaziering, as though it was the White Knights in Petersburg or something on West End Avenue, saying a good Yontif. And I simply have not had a Seder since, in the 46 years I'm now at JTS, that I don't think of Neil Gilman, and I'm grateful to Rabbi Ain for mentioning him. I want to talk about Jewish history, and the truth is my most recent book is the first book I've written about Jewish history. I'm normally a text scholar. I explicate, I explain, I try to do literary or historical approaches to text, but not history writ large. And later, Rabbi Ain will plug a book of mine, which is my first history book. But one of the things I've learned over many, many years, and this goes back to coming to JTS when Rabbi Gilman was there, is that there are many different theories about how to tell the story of the Jews. What is Jewish history? How do we imagine it? And at the time that I was a student at JTS, there was a great, great scholar of Jewish history at Columbia University named Sela Widemeyer Baron. And Sela Baron wrote a gazillion-volume history of the Jews, And every volume was just a masterpiece of old school, what we called Wissenschaft des Judentums, the science of Judaism. Whole volumes of footnotes. But Baron also struggled with how to tell the story of Jewish history. And he rejected what he called the lachrymose theory of Jewish history. The lachrymose theory of history, lachrymose, right, was that all of Jewish history is just a veil of tears, one bad thing after another. And Baron rejected that because he lived through the Holocaust, which would certainly give him a brief to embrace that theory, but then he also lived through the founding of the State of Israel and the absolute renaissance of European Jewish learning in America itself. So for Baron, there were really three legs to Jewish history. Yes, the Holocaust, yes, Israel, but also Jewish culture and Jewish learning. And so he proposed writing a social and religious history of the Jews, in which he celebrated the literary and cultural heritage of the Jews. So I'm going to try and straddle the fence here. I'm going to do a lac-lit history of the Jews, a little lachrymose, a little literary, and to do that, we need to know some numbers. For those of you that are lottery ticket buyers, here's your week's choices. If you can see that far, even better. I couldn't write them any larger because I would take up too many pages. But I'm going to talk about these numbers as I go through, and these numbers are all in what we've learned to call CE. As the great scholars say, was heißt CE? The Common Era. We are a little jittery about using the AD term, since AD is Latin for Anno Domini, and let's be honest, we are Jews, it's not our Domini, so we say the Common Era. It works better if it's BC, which would be before Christ, so we say BCE, before the Common Era. But everything I'm going to talk about today started in 66 of the Common Era. In the year 66, the Jews were in their land of Israel. There had been and was a Jewish community to the east in what we now call Iraq, and what was called in those days Bavel, Babylonia. We know very little about that Jewish community, and I'll come back to them. I'll circle back in a few hundred years, so be patient. Rabbi Ann, I just want to make sure I heard you right. I have 4 hours, right? Okay. So in the year 66, and it wasn't the first time, the Jews rebelled against Rome. There was a interregnum. The emperors were weak, essentially, and we in the eastern provinces thought this might be an interesting possibility. We were far enough, perhaps, from Rome that we could once again declare an independent kingdom. We kind of had that for a little while under a group called the Maccabees. You've heard of them. If you haven't, just wait 2 weeks, because it'll be Hanukkah time. But one of the things the Maccabees achieved was independence. One of the things they destroyed was independence, because they became so corrupt over time that it was fairly easy for them to be conquered and for Rome to set up puppet kings. So in the year 66, we rebelled. It was a dopey thing to do. Rebelling against Rome, which at that time had power all the way west to basically Spain. I'm going to draw a map. This is a map of the ancient world. Okay, this is the Mediterranean. That's North Africa. That's the land of Israel. And you know, because you know your map, now I don't even know what I did with the here, that if we do this in the Mediterranean, you'll know that's Italy. So Italy has Rome right here, and if we go far enough on land, we can go all the way to Europe, through, and really to the very end. Just last month, my wife and I took a vacation for our wedding anniversary, and we went to Lyon. Lyon is a beautiful city in France. south of Paris. I recommend it, by the way. But Lyon was a Roman province. And Lyon has a fabulous now Rome Museum, where the army had a base and where there was really, really a great presence. So you have to appreciate that Rome was an enormous power. They went all the way west to the border of the Atlantic, and they went all the way east to virtually India. Smack in the middle of the map is the land of Israel. And Rome thought that the land of Israel was strategically important because if they controlled this, they could control the land route down to Africa through the Sinai. So they didn't like the idea that we were rebelling against them, and they came in force. We are a stiff-necked people, we Jews, and if you've ever gotten into an argument with, say, your spouse, you know how hard it is to win. And it took Rome 4 full years to suppress the rebellion. But in the year 69 to 70, even as the Jews really thought maybe they had a chance, because that's famously the year of the 4 emperors. In Rome, there were 4 different emperors in one calendar year. You won't be totally surprised to learn that the first 3 did not die of natural causes, nor will you be surprised to learn that the 4th emperor was the guy who controlled all the armies, Vespasian. Vespasian, though, was unusual because he wasn't from the line, the lineage, the family of Julius Caesar and the Augustans. He was his own guy. He was an army man. And he had been besieging Jerusalem, and he left because he was now going to be the new emperor, and he left behind his son Titus. And Titus and his troops breached the walls of Jerusalem, got inside the city, and utterly destroyed it. When I say utterly destroyed it, I mean they plowed it over, and they set to fire the Jerusalem temple. Probably as many as 10,000 Jews were crucified by the Roman army. But the entire Judean province, probably a 200-mile radius around Jerusalem, was denuded of trees, which the Romans used for their war engines and for fuel for their troops. It was denuded. They literally salted the soil so that the Jews could not readily grow food. And what was left, the shell of the remnants of Jerusalem, they began to build Roman pagan temples. I don't think I'm exaggerating to say that the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70 was on a par with the Holocaust. It was the major trauma of Jewish life in a 500-year period. And the Jews were caught completely off guard because they were still happy offering sacrifices in the Jerusalem temple. I'm inviting you to think for a moment that if the Jerusalem temple, let's say, were still standing, how different our Judaism would be. First of all, we'd put a whole lot more pressure on you to go to Israel 3 times a year to offer sacrifices. But second of all, and I love thinking about this on a lovely bema like this, what would a bar and bat mitzvah be like? You know, Timmy will now slaughter the ox, and we would have animal sacrifice. So maybe it was a good thing that the temple was destroyed, but only once the temple was destroyed, and only in the aftermath of that enormous trauma was Rabbinic Judaism able for the first time to emerge as a power. Before the destruction of Jerusalem, the Kohanim held power. They controlled the temple. The remnants of the kings held power, and politics, hardball politics, was often played with the Roman overlords. From 115 to 117, something went terribly awry in the southern Mediterranean. Along the rim of Africa, there were riots in great formerly Jewish communities like Alexandria of Egypt. The rabbis say that if you've never seen the Alexandrian synagogue, you've never seen grandeur in your life. they're not just like talking about Temple Emmanuel. They're talking about a synagogue that they imagine, and I think it's fantasy, was so large. First of all, you have to understand they were fairly observant Jews. They did not use microphones on Shabbat, maybe during the week, but not on Shabbat. So they say that the synagogue was so large that they had ushers up and down the aisles who they would hear what was going on the bima, and the ushers would wave flags so that the people in the back knew to say Amen. It was a fairly efficient system. By the way, that word I just used, the bima, some of you know it, like this raised platform that I'm standing on, the bima. I just want to disabuse you of thinking that it's a Hebrew word. It's not. There is a word that sounds like it in Hebrew, but when the rabbis use the term bima, they're actually borrowing a Greek loanword, because in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, on the eastern Mediterranean, the language that Jews and even Roman soldiers spoke was Greek. And the Greek word bima is the raised platform where a tribunal is held. So when you come up to the bima next time, know that you are being judged. You can be judged by God, or perhaps by people who are looking at what you're wearing and don't maybe like your sports coat or whatever it is, but it's real. So in 115 to 117, in that part of the first century, a whole series of, to be polite, we'll call it riots, broke out in a whole series of Jewish communities. To be more crass about it, it seems like there was an uncoordinated series of pogroms against the Jewish communities. The Jewish communities had enormous privilege, and that privilege was deeply resented, particularly in North Africa, by the natives, because the Jews allied with the Romans for privilege, but then separated themselves from the Romans because we Jews thought we were better than everyone else. So the Romans looked the other way while the natives destroyed the Jewish communities, and entire Jewish communities were destroyed. Sounds like I'm doing the Lachrymose theory of Jewish history, doesn't it? Indeed. One more moment of Lachrymose. From 132 to 135, there was another rebellion against Rome. It's like we never learned our lessons. We just had to keep fighting. This time, the emperor of Rome was a very dapper, nicely bearded, Greek-speaking, Latin and Greek-speaking, out-gay emperor, a very unusual man. People thought he was soft. Turns out he wasn't. So we had a rebellion in the south. In the south of the land of Israel, around, again, the remnants of Jerusalem, there was a fellow named Simon ben Kosiba. Simon. We use his Hebrew name, Shimon. And we tend not to call him ben Kosiba, although that is how he signed his name. I want to say that again. That is how he signed his name. We have his autograph in a document that was recovered in the Judean desert. We have a whole series of Bar Kokhba letters that he dictated. Someone else wrote them in Hebrew, in Aramaic, and in Greek, and he signed his name. Simon, actually a good Roman name, but we call him Shimon ben Kosiba, also known as Bar Kokhba. Some people thought Bar Kokhba was the Messiah. He styled himself as the king of the Jews. He minted, and I can't quite figure this out, 132, 133, 134, 135, right? So at the most 4 years, but he minted 6 years worth of coins. Maybe he was anticipating a longer run, on which he stamped the coins, Shimon Nasi Yisrael. I am Shimon, the Prince of the Jews. He also lost. He not only lost, he lost badly, and he lost a lot. So, but you also need to know that the Jews of the north, the Jews who lived in the Galilee, who had already moved north after the destruction of Jerusalem, they didn't want any part of it. They actually supported Rome in that rebellion. That's something we don't often talk about. They don't teach you that in Hebrew school. That there were Jews who were completely against Bar Kokhba. They thought he was a thug. Indeed, in the Talmud, they say he used to cut the thumbs off of his warriors to prove their mettle. In the letters, the actual letters we recovered, He writes and says, and if you don't follow my orders, I'm going to cut off your thumbs. So what sounds like fantasy may well have been a reality. He was a brutal guy. On the other hand, at Sukkot time, he made sure everybody had a lulav and esrog. Isn't that nice? Shimon lost and lost badly. Hadrian came down with his troops. Again, tens of thousands of Jews were crucified. Jerusalem was utterly laid waste, and they changed it to be called a pagan temple, Aelia Capitolina. And that was the end of Jerusalem for centuries as a Jewish town. The Jews were exiled north. They moved to the Galilee. And in the Galilee, as it turned out, they established quite a cozy presence. The Jews had been there for a long time, farming. Now they began to build large Roman-like cities. Some of you have been to those cities. How many of you have been to Sepphoris? Sepphoris, Tzipori. Tzipori, you know. Okay. How many of you have been to Caesarea or Caesarea? Good. Tiberias. All right, so you hear if I say Caesarea, that's got Caesar in it, and if I say Tveria, it's for the emperor Tiberius. These are real Roman towns, but it's where the Jews who moved north settled, and they became centers of rabbinic Judaism. And one of the great accomplishments in that beautiful Greco-Roman town called Sepphoris, Tzipori, was that a Jewish leader, a rabbi by the name of Rabbi Yehuda started learning from every other rabbi he could because he got a great idea. He was going to have a compendium of all of the oral Torah. And he organized the oral Torah into 6 different, I don't think he would have used this term, but let's call it socio-anthropological categories. Agriculture, the calendar, the role of women, as the Brits would say, courts and torts, sacred things, and taboos. And that became what we know as the Mishnah. That became the absolute document on which all of rabbinic Judaism to this very day is built. The 6 orders of Mishnah, 4 of them were studied fairly intensively in the land of Israel. And I think it's now a consensus among scholars that the 6 orders of Mishnah, which constitute 63 different volumes, small tractates, was entirely transmitted orally. It was oral Torah. I want to remind you that Jews back then are not like Jews now. First of all, despite claims of universal literacy, no one was very functionally literate. It's not like they were listening to YouTube. It's that they didn't have writing materials. They didn't have paper. Literally, they did not have paper. It was not invented yet for them. Papyrus was a bumpy surface. So what did you write on? A leaf? A potsherd? There's a great story about if you write a contract in an ox horn. And then, of course, one rabbi comes along and says, well, is it still attached to the ox? And surprisingly, the answer is yes. Right? Whatever surface you had, you would write on, but they didn't have pencils, they didn't have Sharpies, nothing. So they used their memories. I'm of the ilk that if I go to the grocery store and I realize when I get there that I've left my grocery list at home, and I'll think really hard, and maybe I'll remember, 7 items, and I'll come home with a bag of Twinkies. Because I can't remember 7 items. That's just, if it's not in my phone, it's not in my memory. So they could memorize prodigiously. And as a result, were able to transmit rabbinic literature orally, and probably did so even as it ever expanded for 1,000 years. All of rabbinic literature was orally transmitted. Yeah, kids took notes on little wax slates. But by and large, official documents of the rabbinic world were oral. It sounds kind of astonishing to us and almost unbelievable, but let me just give you 2 items to compare it with. One is Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Iliad and the Odyssey are each about 10,000 lines of poetry. So we're talking about 20,000 lines of poetry, and the great myth about Homer is that he was blind. So I don't think he was reading it from a book. People could recite enormous amounts of material. Let me give you a contemporary model, because when I started at JTS, well before Rabbi Ain was born, probably, I won't put you on the spot, or I guess I just did. I had 7 teachers, 6 of whom were European-born, but 7 teachers who could recite the entire Babylonian Talmud by heart. Now, the truth is that's cheating. Why is it cheating? Because they learned it from a book. So they started with a book. But they reviewed it and repeated it and recited it often enough. And it was for them an act of devotion, of religious devotion, that it entered their memory fast and hard. One of my teachers, he should be well, David Weiss-Halivni, had eidetic imagery. And when I sat in his class, I would watch him shut his eyes and then read the page of the Talmud on his eyelids. David came to America as a Holocaust survivor. He grew up in Siget with Elie Wiesel. They both went through the camps, and they were fast friends until Wiesel's recent death. I once said to Professor Weiss-Halivni, it doesn't seem fair that you can remember everything you saw. It's just, I'm schlepping along, trying hard to remember a few lines of text. You just see it and remember it. And chillingly, he turned to me and he said, Bert, I can't tell you how much I've seen that I wish I could forget. So there's a price. But having paid the price, he and my other teachers knew these texts by heart. So we're talking about an oral literature first collected. I don't want to use the word a law code, because the Mishnah is not a law code. It never actually tells you what the law is. It gives you options. It's a little bit like a Chinese menu, one from column A, one from column B. It's probably a guide for jurists. Here are the opinions that have precedent. This is the case law. Now figure out what to do in the case in front of you. And indeed, for an awfully long time, the Jews of the land of Israel, and subsequently, and now we're coming back to Babylonia, the Jews of Babylonia studied the Mishnah, debated it, argued about it, did the dialectic, until they would have whole strings of possibilities. Again, almost never reaching a conclusion. What they're interested in is the process, so that the jurists on the ground who constitute a court, they know how to think. It's like when you go to law school now. They teach you how to think like a lawyer, which probably means, okay, today we're going to learn about billable hours. That's how to think like a lawyer. But the reality is the process is terribly important, and you can't simply give this is the law, because circumstances change in front of you, and you need to be adept. So the Mishnah is a very important, it's so important, I've got to walk over here and write it down. Mishnah. Around the year 200. And again, the collector, the redactor, the editor, Yehuda Hanasi, Judah the patriarch, was probably in his day the most charismatic, most influential Jew in the world. He also had the attention of Rome. Rome actually appointed him as the patriarch of the Jews. He got along well. He was one of those guys, you get along, you go along. He was a quietist. Rome also gave him a monopoly on the silk trade, because silk used to come from India. The men in the room may not know this. The women in the room will remember. Remember when you couldn't get silk wet? You got silk wet, it had a stain forever. So they never took the Mediterranean. They always went the long way to Rome to bring silk, which meant inevitably they passed through the land of Israel. And if you can collect a toll on the silk, which is already an expensive item, coming through, Judah had some money and he had some clout. And he used it well as a rabbinic Jew. And he essentially, almost single-handedly, coalesced all the previous strands of Judaism to establish a version of Judaism that has lasted to this very day. I was careful to say a version of Judaism. There were many other versions of Judaism. In the land of Israel and in the diaspora, throughout the ancient world, we have uncovered in the last 70 years maybe 100 synagogues. In those 100 synagogues, how many rabbis from the Talmud and the Midrash are named? That is correct, none. 0, none. Although, I dare say, with all due deference to you, Rabbi, if you looked at all the writing here in Sutton Place, Hebrew, but then in the back all the yahrzeit plaques, and then if you went downstairs, you know how the archaeologists know they have a synagogue? A donor plaque. If they find a donor plaque, they know they're in a shul. But how many of anything that's written here mentions the rabbis? Are you on the wall somewhere?
Thankfully, no. You're talking to a synagogue that unfortunately is buried with 3 rabbis, so all of their names and words are on the wall.
Okay, but it's something. So maybe there will be one inscription, one mention. We have 0, which leaves us with a conundrum. Maybe the rabbis were not part of the synagogue movement. It's just the oddest thing to say. Maybe they simply stayed in their academic setting, in their little scholar circles, and did not go out and get their hands dirty in the real world. Or maybe, and this I'm zealous to teach my rabbinical students, maybe they were in synagogues, but no one in the shul paid any attention to them. Imagine that. Around the year 212 of the Common Era, is that up there, 212? In 212, something happened in the West and something happened in the East. In the West, in Rome, there was an emperor by the name of Caracalla, and he got a great idea. He was going to do tax reform. And he promised everyone they'll have lower taxes. And he was right about it. Anyone who had been a citizen of Rome before the year 212 found their taxes went down. Because what Caracalla did was, he said, anyone anywhere in the empire is now a citizen of Rome. So if 10, 50,000 citizens of Rome had their taxes drop, another 4 or 5 million people around the empire suddenly were paying taxes that they had never paid before. An enormous tax burden. What was interesting was that required everybody in the empire to, as it were, register with the IRS, to register with what they called the archives. And suddenly Jews, it's a little bit like Ellis Island, Jews who had lived their whole life as like Reuven ben Levi became Rufus, right? Everybody got a Roman name. If your name was Binyamin, you were called Alexander. Not quite sure how that works, but they got there. And we have a whole list of kind of the equivalent names. It's like me, I go through my life as Bert, but when I'm called up to the Torah, I'm Baruch. I have a Hebrew name. So the Jews of antiquity did that as well. So that was a big deal. That meant that the Jews of the land of Israel were now citizens of Rome. In the meantime, in the east, in what is called Bavel, or we now call Iraq, and they started calling it Iraq probably by about the year 600, there was a change in government. The Parthians and Persians gave way to a Sasanian Zoroastrian empire, and that empire persisted for a long time. The Sasanians were fire worshippers, they were polytheists, but they had a great policy. As long as you pay your taxes, you can have whatever religion you want. And suddenly, the Jews who had been in Babylonia from the time we were exiled from the first temple in 586 BCE, so that's almost 600 years, now 200 years later, 800 years of Jewish presence, suddenly the Jews, I don't know what they were doing for those 800 years, but suddenly those Jews decided to organize in their communities. They kind of had to have home rule. And the rabbis brought the Mishnah from the land of Israel, and they plunked themselves down there and started rabbinic academies. And from the year 212, for 1,000 years, Jews had absolute, unbelievable power in Babylonia. When I say absolute unbelievable power, I don't mean vis-a-vis the Sasanian Empire. I mean in the Jewish community. It was the Fertile Crescent. They were rich. They were like New Yorkers, right? They worried about their cholesterol. They ate fleischiks. Whereas the Jews of the land of Israel, they were the poor cousins. And the Jews of Bavel maybe would send tzedakah to them. And the Jews of Babylonia, you remember Israel like in the first 40 years, how we used to think of them as our poor cousins? Right? So that's how the Jews of Babylonia felt about the Jews of Israel. Like, oh, those poor things, they're there under the thumb of Rome while we're here flourishing. But Babylonian academies really flourished. And we have an idea of just how wealthy the community was because we have a synagogue that survived exactly on the border between the Roman Empire and the Sasanian Empire. In the year 244, the Romans were coming, the Sasanians were coming from the other side, and there on the Euphrates River, the Jews in that synagogue buttressed the walls because it was right at the wall of the city. The city was conquered, and once it was conquered, it was left to rot. And the sands covered it over, and it wasn't until the late 1900s that somebody went to excavate the city of Dura Europos. And when they got to the synagogue and they excavated the synagogue, they found floor-to-ceiling wall paintings. 5 registers of wall paintings in bright, bright colors. It must have been a nauseating place to daven because the colors were so bright and all 4 walls were painted. The ceiling was beautifully tiled, and half of the ceiling tiles were donor plaques and the other half were bas-relief. Some of them, we have a suspicion, might have been bas-relief of the donors themselves. I mean, it's just really remarkable to see how Jews lived in the mid-3rd century. And they're on the edge of the 2 empires. They kind of thought of themselves as a little Roman because in the wall paintings at Dura Europos, all the Jews, they're all biblical paintings. So it could be Mordecai and Esther, it could be King David, it could be Moses in the Nile River. All the Jews are depicted wearing Roman clothing. And all the Gentiles are depicted wearing Persian clothing. So it's very cute. You can figure out who's who in the pictures. Kind of interesting stuff. None of the Jews in any of the pictures is wearing a yarmulke, tzitzit, none of the things we associate with synagogue life. So, you look at them and you think they don't look Jewish, but we know who they are. King David, for instance, is wearing a purple garment, which is, of course, royal purple. So that's King David. Moses is in the Nile River. The original painting, when it was uncovered at Dura Europos, there's a woman in the Nile, maybe Pharaoh's daughter. If you don't know the story about Moses in the Nile, wait a few weeks, we'll get there. So in that painting, she's depicted as naked in the water, stark naked. I always loved that here was a shul and there was this naked lady on the wall. But apparently the excavators were good Christians. So they gave her a bikini. And now when you see paintings of that picture, she's wearing a little bikini. I think it's hysterical because I've seen the original photos and she was naked. Just saying. But it gives you a feel for who the Jews were. While that's going on in the city of Caesarea, not only was there a great rabbinic community, Rabbi Hoshaya, Rabbi Chia, some of the great first-generation rabbis subsequent to the Mishnah, but there was also one of the great church fathers, Origen of Caesarea. Origen was a critical Bible scholar, maybe one of the greatest Bible scholars, I'm not exaggerating, maybe one of the greatest Bible scholars who ever lived. And Origen was a Greek speaker. He was originally from Alexandria. He followed the methods of, as I'm quoting him, the Jew Philo. But he also learned Aramaic and Hebrew and studied the Bible and preached. It turns out that his theology wasn't always so aye with the rest of the church, and they declared him a heretic. But it just must have been a fascinating place to be, 3rd century Caesarea. Again, how many of you have been to Caesarea? Looming over it is the aqueduct. And I'm reminding you of just the brilliance of Roman architecture and Roman engineering. Aqueducts run on gravity. And we're talking about an aqueduct that was bringing water from the Galilee all the way down the seacoast. Just titrated just so. There was a wave break out into the harbor. And now they've excavated underwater, and they see that it was dotted with shops and stores. People used to stroll the promenade, I guess, like Atlantic City in its heyday or something like that. Now it's, I guess, Mediterranean City. But there was a vibrant Jewish community. That vibrancy was complicated. It was complicated, and I gave you the first clue of it, because someone like Origen was a church father. And I'm now, for the first time, mentioning, oh yeah, there was a church. Oh yeah, there was Christianity. And I did it that way on purpose, because in rabbinic literature, the first 300 years of Christianity, the rabbis by and large were like this. Like, either their attitude was, maybe if we don't look, they'll disappear, or, I'm the baby brother, so I can attest this. My sister used to ignore me, assuming that if she ignored me long enough, I would disappear. And often it worked. I would get bored, I'd go somewhere else. And I think the rabbis thought that would happen with Christianity. It was another one of those crazy heresies. Some of you know the story of Christianity. You've heard about it. Wait, I'll do it again. How many of you have heard of Christianity? Show of hands. Okay. So you know that the first, he didn't know he was Christian. He just thought he was a nice Jewish boy from Nazareth. There was a guy named Yehoshua, Jesus, from Nazareth, and his disciples in the Gospels, which are written after the destruction of the temple, his disciples called him, they write it out in Greek for us so we can hear how it sounds. They called him Rabbi. Yeah, isn't that ironic that the first person we know with the title rabbi was actually Jesus of Nazareth? And, you know, it's a story that a lot of synagogues know, right? He got his congregants really annoyed. They crucified the rabbi. Big news. You were supposed to laugh at that. So, by and large, I'm kind of with the rabbis on this. One of my scholarly pursuits is the interaction of Judaism and Christianity, both in Christian and in Jewish literature of the period. And the rabbis are assiduously avoiding Christianity. But in the year 312, the emperor of Rome decided he was now a Christian. And overnight, Christianity went from being an illegal religion, because they didn't worship the gods, to becoming a licit religion. And by 325, Christianity was incredibly well established as the religion of the Roman Empire. And in the next 200 years, little by little, the Christians first persecuted amongst themselves, people whose theology they didn't like, heresy, out. Then they persecuted pagans, and you can pretty much predict who's coming next. Then they persecuted the Jews. So between 312 and 325, we have the Emperor Constantine, his mother Helena. Now, his mother Helena inadvertently played an enormously powerful role in the development of the land of Israel. She decided she was going to go on a tour of the Holy Land. Her son was now a Christian. He was the emperor of Rome. She should be a good, supportive mother. So she went on a tour of the Holy Land. I would love to know who Helena's tour guide was. Because wherever he said, oh, and that's where Jesus did the loaves and fishes, Helena would say, oh, that's lovely, let's build a church. And when you're the emperor's mother, you got a lot of money to build a church. So in the 4th century, particularly in the Galilee, there was a huge building boom of churches. And even as the Jewish community's luck was turning because the Holy Land was a Christian Holy Land, suddenly there were all these guys in the building trades looking for the next project, so they began building shuls as well. And we have from the 4th through the 7th century in the Galilee literally dozens of beautiful basilica synagogues. They follow if I say they follow the Roman plan, you may not know what exactly I mean. But if here on the east side, you can walk to some of the big synagogues. Emmanuel is a beautiful example of it. And you're seeing a basilica. So The synagogues, certainly churches look like that, but also synagogues look like that, a good Roman building. And Christianity is now on the rise. They are building, and it means that in almost every major town, a church and a synagogue are literally facing off in the town square. I wish I could tell you everybody got along well, and everybody sang Kumbaya, and for Thanksgiving they all had a meal together, and then they discovered that they should, do an iftar dinner. It didn't quite work like that. Except there was a brief respite. From 361 to 363, within that same century that Christianity was taking over, there was an emperor by the name of Julian. And Julian, the day he became emperor, as it were, came out of the closet. He had been raised as a Christian. Everybody thought he'd be the next great Christian emperor. And Julian said, well, now that I'm an emperor, I do want to share something with you. I'm still a pagan. And I'm going to restore animal sacrifice to the gods. And because I think Christianity is perverse, I'm also going to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. And he started the project. Two things happened in 363. Number one, there was an earthquake in Jerusalem. And whatever building they had done on the third temple, it was destroyed. Which, to state the obvious, gave the Christians a great deal of glee. They thought it was proof that the Jews were perfidious and that Jesus was truly God. And if that weren't enough, somebody stabbed Julian, and that was the end of him. And then, from that point onward, the empire went back to being a Christian empire. The Jews started to really feel it by imperial law, and particularly by monks who would rev up the communities to burn down synagogues, punch Jews in the face. They would march through towns waving tiki torches, the whole schmear. But even as that happened, the Jews in the Galilee understood that their mazel had changed. And there was a period of consolidation that turned out to be one of the most fruitful literary periods in rabbinic history. All the studying of the Mishnah they had done up till that point, all the debate, they began to organize and memorize, and they called that Gemara, the ongoing learning of Mishnah. And Mishnah and Gemara together made up what we now call the Talmud of the land of Israel. That's the first Talmud. It was probably put together somewhere, I would guess, between 375 and 450. I'm giving you a 75-year range because in my 45 years at JTS, the range has ticked and tocked back and forth like a metronome. So say 425. We'll split the difference. When they published, how do you publish an oral document? You tell your memory expert, go out and recite. And the memory expert became the guy in the academy. They would say to him, we need the 7th chapter of the tractate of Shabbat in the order of holidays. And he'd start reciting. It would be, like pushing the button on your recorder. He was a memory expert. That's what he did. If you have a really, really, really good memory, it's best that you be stupid. Because if you're smart, you start tinkering with the text. You make it a little better. So the rabbis preferred their memory experts to be nothing more, I'm quoting them, than a bag of books. They just wanted the guy to recite as he heard it. Don't make it better. We don't need editorial here. We'll take care of that, thank you. So we have the Palestinian Talmud. When I use the word Palestine, I'm talking about Roman Palestine, not now, then. We have rabbinic commentary on many of the books of the Torah. On the book of Genesis, we have 100 chapters. So the book of Genesis in your Bible volumes is 50 chapters. The rabbinic Genesis is called Big Genesis, New, Improved Genesis. It's 100 chapters. And the rabbis comment on virtually every verse of Genesis, every word of Genesis, sometimes like the word Bereshit, the first word, sometimes on individual letters of Genesis. They have a lot to say. And what do they say? Mostly, they are reading it through a lens that makes the book contemporary for their own time. Contemporary for their own science. They're interested in Neoplatonism, the physics of Neoplatonism. They're interested in Greco-Roman philosophy. They're interested in architecture, all the kind of things that was part of their daily life. So we have the Talmud, we have the Midrash on Genesis. There's a Midrash from that era, early 5th century, on Leviticus. Now, those of you who have read the book of Leviticus know that it is largely concerned with, I'm going to use a technical term here, it's spelled I-C-K, ick, right? If you read Leviticus, there's a lot of ick in Leviticus. Bodily fluids, flows, psoriasis, and like ick. And in the Midrash on Leviticus, in the 5th century Galilee, the rabbis did something that most modern rabbis also do. They ignored the contents of Leviticus. They just pretended it wasn't there. And so they only comment on fewer than 20% of the verses in Leviticus, but along the way, they teach you the entire ideology of Rabbinic Judaism, and in large measure, they do it through entertaining stories. When people ask me what I do for a living, Rabbi Ain said, I do Midrash. And really, one of the things I do with pleasure is Agadah, rabbinic narrative. How do we explain this? Don't listen for a second. Everybody gossips about their rabbi, right? Now, here's the thing. If you gossip about your rabbi and it's repeated often enough, it becomes almost formulaic. So that if you're on the receiving end of a rumor that you perhaps yourself started, you know exactly how it's going to sound and what it's going to say and who's with who and blah, 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 blah. And then, so take that formulaic gossip, wait 500 years, and you have sacred literature. That's Midrash. That's what I teach. So we have Midrash on Genesis. We have Midrash on Leviticus. We have Midrash on the Song of Songs. Have any of you ever read the Song of Songs? We tend to read it on Seder night if you go to a long Seder, like the Gilman Seder. It's a long book. As my late teacher, may he rest in peace, H.L. Ginsburg, wrote in his introduction in the Jewish Publication Society translation, I'm quoting him verbatim about Song of Songs. The book is entirely profane. It's erotic literature. I mean, it's good erotic literature. It's beautiful love poetry. But it does beg the question, what's it doing in the Bible? Like all of a sudden we have erotic poetry in the Bible. Along comes a 2nd century rabbi, Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Akiva says, oh, it's metaphor. It's really about God's love for the Jews. And that metaphor, that notion that we could read through the lens of allegory, it's not really about two lovers, it's about God and the Jewish people, then it becomes a sacred text. So we have Midrash on Song of Songs. We have Midrash on the Book of Lamentations, in which the rabbis discuss the destruction not only of the first temple, but also the second temple, and kind of everything else they can throw in as well. So we have rabbinic ideology. We have rabbinic back and forth argumentation on the Talmud. We have an incredibly rich, if idiosyncratic literature. I say idiosyncratic. The Mishnah is not unlike Roman case law. But the Talmud is unlike anything at all that you've seen. There is a recent book refers to it as Socratic dialogue, and there certainly is argumentation. But it becomes a hodgepodge, not just of law, but of lore, of recipe, I mean literally recipes, ghost stories, all kinds of medicine, beliefs. It's quite a marvelous read. Almost any page, well, first of all, let me say every page of the 2,700 folios of the Talmud has Jews arguing with one another. So you know that it really represents the Jewish soul. But as well, the arguments, they can veer off, along a side. Eventually, maybe they'll get back to where they were. It really does. I mean, it's a Jewish voice from A to Z. And this is one of the great literary things. But when they comment on the books and they read, like in Genesis Rabbah, line by line, word by word, everything out of context, that's a very odd way to read. The only people who have read quite that bizarrely since that time have been at Yale University from 1972 to about 1985, when the Yale School of Literary Studies did deconstruction. And suddenly every word had its own value, and there was no authorial intent, and the critic, who was, of course, at Yale, was everything. But that's a little bit the way the Gemara works. It just takes things apart. The Midrash takes the Bible apart, but in doing so, it finds a mode of expression that quintessentially advances a Jewish way of being in the world. We are suspicious, we are argumentative, we are exceedingly smart, and when it comes to the Word of God, well, we're going to tangle with God, and maybe if we do well, we'll come out on top of the argument. There's a marvelous story in the Talmud in which the rabbis argue with God and basically say, mind your own business. And in the coda to the story, God is tickled pink. I mean, it's a rabbinic fantasy, obviously. But there it is. While this is going on in the church is starting to flex its muscle. Just to the north of the land of Israel, where am I? There, in Antioch, there's a great church father named John Chrysostom. He's called St. John Chrysostom, John of the Golden Tongue. And over a number of years, he gives a series of sermons on Sunday morning. These guys were trained in rhetoric. This is somewhere between, well, right about that time, somewhere between 375 and 410. They were trained rhetorics. By the way, the patriarch of the land of Israel, the Jewish patriarch, also sent his son to Antioch to learn at the rhetorical school. So all the grandees, the Harvard, Yale, Princeton types, they all studied together. They all learned rhetoric. They all knew how to argue. They all knew how to tell a good sermon. The difference is that when John Chrysostom preached in his church on a Sunday morning, right there was somebody with a notebook taking notes, a shorthand writer, a notarios. And on Monday morning, Chrysostom would come into the office and edit his sermon for publication. The same was true in North Africa. There. It's a real useful map, isn't it? Where in the town of Hippo Regius, which is now in modern Tunisia, there was a guy by the name of Augustine. We call him St. Augustine. If you're from Florida, you call him St. Augustine. But St. Augustine. Augustine was a Latin, he was North African, he was a Latin speaker. Chrysostom was a Greek speaker. But they both, not only were they great expositors of the Old Testament and the New, but they had a lot to say about the Jews. In Chrysostom's church in Antioch, he went off on a tear, 8 different sermons, which up until the mid-20th century were always translated as Chrysostom's sermons against the Jews. And then somebody pointed out that, in fact, that's not what the Greek says. What the Greek says is sermons against the Judaizers. They're like, what's a Judaizer? Like, is that somebody who makes someone Jewish, a moil or something? What it means is that there were people, and he's very clear about it in the sermon, people in his church on Sunday morning who he knows had been in shul on Saturday. And it makes him bananas. Why are you going to that place? It's undermining the whole project of Christianity. Why, when you take an oath, do you bring your business partner and take out a Sefer Torah to make the oath on? Pasnisht. You go and hear the shofar. You go and watch the palm fronds. Better you should come at Easter time and see us do Palm Sunday. Right? I mean, it's just, you hear him fulminating, but what you understand is he's living in a very urban environment where the Christians of Antioch are quite comfortable with the Jewish community. Antioch was basically, the Jewish community lived in a suburb, if you will. Think of it as Silver Spring, Maryland. They commuted into the town of Antioch and worked in the government. And in Daphne, which is the name of the town, Daphne is, I'm trying to think of the name of, we use it for cooking. A laurel wreath. You know, a laurel leaf? You can't eat it, but it gives a nice odor to things. Like, you know, if you make artichokes or something, you throw in a laurel. Pardon? Yes, and you could wear a little laurel wreath around your head. So the Jews lived in the town called Daphne. They would commute into, but they also, in Daphne, in addition to having synagogues. They claimed there were 8 synagogues in Antioch. The Jews worked in the tourist industry because there was a shrine to Artemis, and apparently they sold tchotchkes. So it was just a really urbane community, and this was where the Jews and the Christians and the pagans mixed it up together. Sometimes they were friends, sometimes they complained. Augustine was the first church father to say, hey, we own the army now. We are Rome. We're not the bad guys. We are Rome. Rome is good. Rome is Christian. And we're going to use the army to suppress people who disagree with us. And so the army started first suppressing Christians who Augustine disagreed with, and ultimately came to suppress the Jews. So in the West, for all that there was a building boom, Jews came more and more under the heel of Christianity. And if I tell you that persisted all the way into our move to Europe around the year 1000 and throughout the Middle Ages and up to the Holocaust, that's not news. We know that. That's the lachrymose theory of Jewish history, and it's well-founded on a lot of sad facts. I once heard one of my rabbinical students, with horror but humor, explain to a non-Jew that the basic message of all Jewish holidays is the same. They tried to kill us. You know the rest of it, right? God saved us. Let's eat. Right? But that's really the lachrymose theory of Jewish history. And in the West, the community became ever more tenuous and ever poorer. In the East, in the Fertile Crescent, in Mesopotamia, in Babel, the Jews continued to be powerful. 150 years after the Talmud of the land of Israel, they did their own Talmud. That's called the Babylonian Talmud. And nowadays, when people say, I'm studying Talmud, they mean the Babylonian Talmud. Much of the custom that we follow is the custom of the Babylonian community. It's very interesting that we, in a very powerful diaspora Jewish community, relate so profoundly to that other very powerful diaspora Jewish community, the Iraqi Babylonian Jewish community. When the Bavli came to a close in the 6th century, they actually by then had bricks and mortar institutions. That's the first time you hear of yeshivot, a good old-fashioned yeshiva, where the boys, it was patriarchal, came and they studied Talmud. They actually studied every year 2 tractates of Talmud. So they would learn Mishnah, they would learn Gemara, they knew their stuff, they did a little midrash. And if you know enough history, what's the last date I'm put on there? Can anybody say it out loud? Yeah, that's my joke. Because 613 should be an easy number for Jews to remember. That's the number of mitzvot in the Torah. The medievals say there are 248 positive commandments, 365 negative commandments, 613 commandments. Somewhere between 612 and 620 in the Arabian Peninsula was the birth of a man named Muhammad. And that's where I stop. Because when Muhammad and his armies swept out of the Arabian Peninsula, the world changed. The borders fell. There was no longer East and West. It all became the caliphate. Let me just say a couple of words about that. First of all, Muhammad was generally on good relations with the Jews. One of his wives was Jewish. He had one town that was Jewish that things fell apart, and he got very angry at them and leveled that town. But by and large, he did well, as long as the Jews, quote unquote, knew their place, which is to say, we were dhimmi. We were subject to his Islamic rule. And when that happened, Jews genuinely flourished. In North Africa, in Grenada, Jews flourished. Why is it called the caliphate? Because the guy who replaced Muhammad was his replacement. In Hebrew, when you replace someone, that's called a machlif. A khalif became the caliph, right? It is a good Arabic and Hebrew word. And in that first generation after Muhammad's death, there was already a split in the community who should be his replacement. Should it be someone from his bloodline? And he had a nephew named Ali. So there were the partisans of Ali, the Shiite Ali, who became the Shiites. And then there were those who thought, no, we're going to follow the rule of the community. Whoever is the best qualified to lead, he will lead our sunnah, our our community, and they became the Sunnis. And to this day, I don't have to tell you, all you got to do is pick up the paper. Sunnis and Shiites disagree a little bit about how they should live in the world. So I'm pretty sure that Professor Dr. Gampel will pick up right where I left off, because I know he likes to talk about Islam as well. But I think we have a little time for, you can ask a question, you can make a comment, you can offer a rebuttal, but no more than 30 seconds so everyone has a chance. And because we're taping this, there's a mic in the middle, so if you have a question, line up at the mic and speak into the microphone. Oh, I know. No, go to the mic, please. I know it's...
Naomi, you can just speak loudly.
Speak loudly. I'll repeat it, okay?
When was the Talmud written?
When you ask written, do you mean written, or do you mean...
Talmud written because you said the others were oral.
So, most scholars today believe, when I say most scholars today believe, I'm leaving myself an out that's large enough to drive a truck through. But most scholars today believe that not only this Talmud of the land of Israel, but also the Babylonian Talmud was transmitted orally. There are Gaonim, rabbinic academy heads in North Africa in the 8th and 9th century who boast, my students have studied all of the Talmud, and they've never seen a book. So, a marvelous scholar by the name of Talia Fishman, who teaches at the University of Pennsylvania, wrote an incredibly influential book a few years ago called Becoming the People of the Talmud, in which she argues it's really only essentially in Europe where there was suddenly plentiful paper, right? Because Europe had forests, and there was paper that Jews started inscribing, writing down the Talmud. And only once it was inscribed, I mean, even now in a print edition, it's 20 volumes. It's a big book. So quite literally, the weight of the Talmud gave it the status that it now has. Before that, she argues, it was one more among many rabbinic Jewish sources. It was learned, it was studied, it was a major focus of study, but the authority that we give it only came about in the Middle Ages, from 1000 onward. Maybe Dr. Gampel will talk a little bit more about that. If not, you can ask him. Push him to do it, because he knows this stuff as well as I do, and maybe better. But it's a remarkable phenomenon that I'm reporting, that we Jews essentially chose to transmit our entire literature orally. When I see my students now, and I lament that they can't read a damn newspaper, they need the 30-second video clip, I'm a little rueful, because I realize, after all this time, we're reverting once again to oral culture. I ask my students, what literature do you know by memory? And they're like, oh, what do I know by memory? So then I say, who in the room can recite song lyrics? And they literally know hundreds of song lyrics. I ask them, what's your favorite TV show? I have students, young students, who can recite Seinfeld episodes. It wouldn't be my canon of choice, but I had to learn. I had to learn to make Harry Potter references, because that's their canon, right? And I have students who almost know it by heart. Maybe because they've seen the movies, I don't know. But it's just an interesting phenomenon that we're in a place now. We are rebuilding the library of the Jewish Theological Seminary. I hope all of you know that we're in the midst of this enormous and wonderful rebuilding project. I've been at JTS so long that I was there before the library that we just took down was even built. And we built it so that it would house all of these books. What we didn't think was that there would be a time that we didn't need books anymore, right? My students come into class. They not only have the Bible and the whole Talmud, they have instant recall. I can say to somebody in my class, assuming they're not texting someone else, look up the verse. How often does this word appear? Boom, they got it. So I have witnessed the change, and we're rebuilding the new library so that we can account for not only the unbelievable books that we have. We have one of the largest collections of Hebrew books in the world, one of the largest collections of Jewish manuscripts in the world, the largest collection of incunabula in the world, but we are also building a library that will be ready for the next 100 years of electronics. And when I say 100 years, you probably know every 3-4 years, electronic devices are outmoded. So we're really trying to build a smart library and really trying to anticipate with all of the people in the tech industry, what's a book going to look like 30 years from now? How are we going to transmit our Torah? Because that's an important question we're asking. Yes? The question is, how do you protect the integrity of a story when it's passed on orally? So it depends on the story. I spent a decade of my life working with Jewish manuscripts, so I have an idea about how slippery sometimes tradition can be. In legal documents, there is virtually a pecking order. The Torah, because of a lot of legal hedges around it, a scribe has to follow all kinds of rules. The Torah is fairly well transmitted, I'd say to 99% accuracy over the last 2,000 years. It's a stunning achievement. The Mishnah, less so. In fact, if we look at the Mishnah in the Talmud of the land of Israel, and we look at the Mishnah in the Babylonian Talmud, we'll find dozens of very small changes, of here, of not there, past tense versus future tense, things like that. If we're in legal material, it tends to stay fairly staid. Although in the library of the Jewish Theological Seminary, we have 2 different sets of Maimonides' laws, his Yad HaChazakah, Maimonides' Mishneh Torah. What makes them unbelievable is that they are corrected. They're written in a beautiful scribal hand, and there is a hand correcting them or offering a different reading in a second edition. What makes it all the more fascinating is we know whose hand it is because we have his autograph, Maimonides' own. So he's correcting or re-editing a book. Now, I do Agadah, I do Jewish narrative, the story. And I have to tell you, nobody ever tells the same story the same way twice. So there's a lot of variation. In my day, when I did my doctoral dissertation, we thought we could retrieve the original story, as though there was some Platonic ideal. And we have moved away from that in the 30, 40 years since I wrote my dissertation. We don't think that's going to happen anymore because it's oral transmission and it's narrative. And if I tell you a story, I can tell you the exact same story, but I'm going to tell it differently each time. So your question's right on point. And it depends on which corner of the literature you're in, how much integrity it will or won't have, and how much faithfulness to transmission it will or won't have. Yes, please. Yes. Actors have well-trained memories, although I have some colleagues and friends who are actors who confess to me that every now and again on stage, they forget what they're supposed to be saying. So I said, so what do you do then? They said, as long as I remember the last line, so it's the cue to the guy who's going to come in next, everybody's happy. No one even notices, right? So you can make up your own soliloquy as long as you get the same last line so the guy knows, now it's my turn. But so there is sometimes fluidity. I just recently saw a Shakespeare play where there's a great deal of debate whether Shakespeare in fact was the author and whether it has any consistent standard text. Homer is now fairly standardized, but no one believes any longer that Homer was one person. They think Homer was a whole industry of transmission of narrative tales, and there's been a great deal of study about it.
First of all, there's a tradition that there were 2 schools, Hillel and Shammai, and you follow Hillel. Is this always the case?
So the question is, in the first century, the cusp, first century BCE and CE, there were 2 great schools of the pre-rabbinic order. They're both called elders, never called rabbis, elders, Hillel HaZaken. And For the most part, rabbis follow Hillel. There are 18 cases where we follow Shammai. The question is, was this always the case? And I would say yes, as long as you were in the school of Hillel. If you were in the school of Shammai, maybe not so much. And it's notoriously thorny for us to recover actual history from those documents. We know how the rabbis transmit it. We know what they believed. But we have rabbis, the Mishnahs from the year 200. They're thinking back 200 years earlier about an oral tradition. So accuracy is often difficult. Look, we are all witnessing a time where something that's on tape from 6 months ago is now no longer so secure, right? So how you transmit a narrative and the stakes of that narrative can really make a difference. I would love to believe that all of our sages were, this is the law, this is what we follow, but they were partisans too.
May I also ask?
Yes.
Given the patriarchal narrative of Jewish history, what about the women? And what do we know about the role of women, beginning with Gloria, but also...
So I want to say two things about women. One, which is obvious, but bears notice. Women are half, maybe a little over half of the Jewish population, and apparently always have been, at least going back to Adam and Eve. But men have always told the stories up until the 20th century, which means we know nothing about women. What we know is a man's fantasy about what he thinks a woman should be. And even someone like Bruria, a woman who has a voice in the Talmud, a woman who disagrees with her husband, and it turns out she's right and he's wrong. My wife is an attorney, and she spent a lot of her life as a litigator. And nothing is more valuable in our marriage than these words: you were right and I was wrong. But even Bruria, Rabbi Meir's wife, we only know about her through the lens of male rabbinic storytellers. She might look and say, that's not what I said. That wasn't me at all. We don't know, because women were silenced for so long. Because I do midrash, because I do rabbinic narrative, I have to say one of the greatest things in the 20th and 21st century of what I'll call modern midrash, of giving voice to biblical characters, of reading and doing Jewish identity, one of the greatest things that has happened is women have suddenly had a voice. And now biblical women suddenly are being given a voice. Rabbinic women are being given a voice. Modern women are talking, and it has enriched our Judaism. Well, I don't have to tell you, you have Rachel Lane as your rabbi. Among everything else, let me just say one thing about JTS, because when I came there, the notion of women's ordination wasn't even on the screen. Nobody was even thinking about it. And I lived through the battles. And one thing no one actually figured out, which we should have, but we didn't, was the day we started admitting women, we doubled the size of the applicant pool, which meant we could be much more selective. So the very notion of saying we're going to now start ordaining women made all the students we accepted a lot smarter. And it's been that case ever since. Thank you, Rabbi Ain. So, yes, you had a question, sir.
I would like to ask you two questions. I'm the teacher, so I would like to go to the music of our history. Number one, since Susan asked about women part, what was the women part of Beis Hamikdash, or the Shorim, the Levites, singing at the Beis Hamikdash? Some historians say that women were singing at the temple.
I'm not aware of that. One thing I am aware of is that, with the exception of, this is according to the male patriarchal rabbis, with the exception of one day a year, which might not have even really been a day of the year, it was probably a date in Sukkot, there was no mechitza in the Beit HaMikdash, in the outer courts, and men and women mixed freely. Women brought sacrifices and participated in the sacrificial service. I do not know of any evidence, though, that women sang in the Beit HaMikdash. There were boy sopranos. My father, may he rest in peace, and he's gone since 1973, when he was a young man, when I was a real little kid, he used to almost tiptoe around the house Rosh Hashanah time, because when he was a child, he sang falsetto in Yossela Rosenblatt's choir. So I learned all of these soprano melodies from my father. but my mother was not singing them. And I think that was the case in the Beit HaMikdash. I wouldn't be totally stunned if it turned out that women sang. For a century of archaeology, two things persisted. If there was a balcony, archaeologists assumed it was the women's section. God forbid, they might just say, oh, look, there was a second floor to the synagogue. And if there was a woman's name, like the Arche Synagoga, the synagogue president, but in the feminine form, archaeologists annoyingly would say, oh, it's an honorific. Her husband must have been the shul president. And a scholar from Brandeis University pointed out that in virtually every case where there's an Arche Synagoga, her husband's never mentioned. So maybe she was the synagogue president. Is that so hard? And now people just assume that, yes, women did have roles in synagogues, and the second floor might have been just that, a second floor. And men and women sat, horrors, mixed seating. You know why mixed seating is so bad, right? It leads to mixed dancing. Yes, you had a question. It's got to be a good one. It's the last one. So what we know about the Mishnah is that there were oral teachings, that the rabbis received oral teachings and passed them down. Now, I had a teacher, he was educated first at YU, but his doctorate was from JTS, he was ordained at JTS, who insisted to us as kids that there had been oral teaching ever since the time of Moses. Because if there wasn't oral teaching, how would the Jews know how to observe Shabbat in the wilderness? There's almost no Shabbat law written in the Torah. So he said there's always been oral accompaniment. All right. At some point in time, though, the rabbis began to coalesce. In rabbinic tradition, we attribute that to three great rabbis. The first is Rabbi Akiva, who began sorting. He began the process of putting, and they liken it to somebody who has a stack full of grain, and then it's like the kid with the peas on the plate. This has to be here, this has to be there. They can't touch. So this was in this pile, this was in this pile. Akiva began the sorting process. Akiva's student, Rabbi Meir, persisted and sorted more and refined. And then Yehuda Hanasi came along and he said, these are the 6 orders, these are the tractates, this is the material. Anything that's not in my Mishnah is still authentic Tannaitic teaching, it's just not in my Mishnah. And it is the job of a great deal of rabbinic documents in the 3rd, 4th, 5th century to recover those early teachings, sometimes to argue them together with the Mishnah and to harmonize them. But we have a full body. So it looks like the Mishnah, by the rabbi's own admission, was a process of redaction over at least 3 generations. Did I leave anything out?
So I want to thank Bert for his remarks, his teaching. You can see how fortunate I was to be able to sit in many classes over our time together, the 9 years I was at JTS. This is his book, Aphrodite and the Rabbis, How the Jews Adapted Roman Culture to Create Judaism as We Know It. There will be copies outside. They're $20, cash only. We apologize, but it's cash only. It's going directly to him. I want to...
And it's discount.
And it's a discount, yes, it's a discount. I want to end how I began by speaking just for a second about Rabbi Gilman. One of Rabbi Gilman's contributions to Jewish life, rabbinic life, philosophical life was the concept of myth, that which is mythological doesn't need to be false. It just can't be historically proven. And what was so powerful, and for generations heretical, but by the time it got to my generation, it seemed obvious, is that you can make meaning out of that which isn't proven historically, but you can find meaning in all of the messages. Lots of what we know is based on history and archaeology, and lots of what we know is based on the literature that Bert and so many other teachers have studied. But what's incredible is that for the past 2,000 years, we've been taking those pieces and we've been making meaning out of them to ask ourselves, how do we live as Jews today? And the most constant thing about Judaism is change, and that we understand that being Jewish is engaging with these ideas and engaging with these texts and making them relevant today, but not only for today, not only building a community for today, but building a vision, a dream, and a community for the future. And it's really exciting to have everybody here studying, and I hope that you'll continue to come to the other lectures and bring your friends. Have a great night. Thank you.
I'll put this out there?
Yeah.